The morning unfolded gently, as it always did, with me cradling a mug of coffee on my grandmother's century-old porch swing, the sunrise spilling pink across the sky, brushing the purple trim of our Victorian home with a soft glow. That trim, Grandma's pride, a bold splash against the weathered clapboard, had stood for 3 generations, a quiet rebellion against the beige conformity creeping up Maple Street. Then I saw her, Corinne Thompson, power-walking toward my mailbox, an envelope gleaming in her manicured grip like a trophy, her phone already snapping photos of my front yard. Grandma's wild roses, their unruly beauty a thorn in Corinne's side next to her pristine boxwoods. My stomach knotted. I'd seen that look at her HOA meetings, held in her garish McMansion next door, where she preached progress with a smile that never reached her eyes. And now she lingered, ensuring I'd notice her delivery before strutting off, smug as ever. The envelope held her latest salvo, an invitation to join her newly minted HOA, a glossy brochure of identical beige houses staring back at me. A $5,000 fee and $350 monthly dues just the start. But it was the attached list that made my hands shake. Strip the purple trim, uproot the heritage rose garden, silence the antique wind chimes that had lulled me to sleep since childhood, all to erase my home's soul for her sterile vision. Through the window, I caught her on the phone, her voice drifting over. Yes, I delivered the final invitation. She'll have to join now. Her house is the last holdout. Once it's in line, property values will skyrocket. That evening, I marched to her door, invitation in hand, her doorbell blaring, "We are the champions," as she answered, her neighborhood watch badge glinting, her lips curling in a practiced grin. "I've reviewed your invitation," I said, my voice steady from years on the bench, "and I decline. This house is my family. For 3 generations, I'll keep its historic character." Her smile vanished, eyes narrowing. "This isn't an invitation. The HOA's registered. You're surrounded. You have to join." I pulled out property maps I'd researched that afternoon. "Actually, my deed predates your HOA. I'm not legally bound. 20 years of law taught me that." Corinne's face flushed crimson, her sweetness peeling away. "This neighborhood's changing. Progress is happening. If you don't get on board, things might get difficult. Accidents happen. Citations pile up." I met her stare. "Is that a threat, Mrs. Thompson?" She stepped back, smile snapping back like a mask. "Of course not. Just worried about property values and safety. Old houses can be so unpredictable, electrical issues, structural problems." Behind her, her husband, Bob, watched from their window, phone in hand, his stance prickling my instincts. "1 week," she called as I turned away, "to reconsider before the HOA discusses enforcement options." Her voice a blade wrapped in silk, and I noticed new eyes peering from neighboring windows, her allies, no doubt. Back home, I installed security cameras, documenting every inch of my property's pristine condition. 3 decades as a federal judge had honed my gut, and it screamed Corinne was only starting. I didn't know then this wasn't just about trim or roses. It was a war brewing, one that would torch my home and test how long I'd hide my gavel. As the wind chimes sang me to sleep, I wondered how far she'd push before realizing she picked the wrong target. A judge with justice in her veins and a promise to keep. Corinne's war kicked off at dawn, her shrill voice piercing my quiet morning as I peeked through the curtains, spotting her leading a pack of HOA minions on their inspection. Cameras flashing at my purple trim, my roses, my wind chimes, her smugness a beacon in the crisp air. "Look at those hideous trims. They're ruining property values," she crowed, her group nodding like trained seals, their whispers drifting over. "Those chimes aren't approved. Those roses are 3 inches too tall." I tried sipping my coffee on the porch, but their onslaught drowned out the sunrise. Orange warning letters soon plastered my door, citing fake violations. My rose garden a nuisance, the trim an eyesore. By Tuesday, I caught Corinne measuring my grass with a ruler, barking, 11.5 inches, 3.5 over code. To her lackey Barbara, scribbling furiously, and when I stepped out, coffee in hand, "You're trespassing," I said, calm but firm. She just smirked, snapping more photos undeterred. The harassment grew inventive. Saturday mornings jolted awake by landscapers roaring at 7:00 a.m., their mowers loudest by my bedroom. Weekly code enforcement visits waved off with my historic status papers while Corinne fumed from her perch. HOA meetings staged in her driveway, right outside my home office, her voice cutting through my walls. "Some houses need dealing with for everyone's good." My cameras caught their pettiness, dogs unleashed on my lawn, Corinne gasping, "Oh, my Bentley would never." As her doodle left steaming gifts, her pearls clutched tight. At their block party, me uninvited, she crowed, "Some older properties don't fit our vision." glancing at my home while her cronies snapped foundation photos, muttering about structural concerns. I stayed patient, filing every letter, every frame of footage. Light pollution from their blinding security lights aimed at my windows added to my growing dossier. Grandma's lessons in timing ringing in my ears as Karen's boldness swelled. Then at midnight, I woke to a kitchen light flicking on, catching Karen and two board members skulking outside, chemical sprayers aimed at my rose garden. My heart stopped as I stormed to the porch phone recording. "What are you doing?" Karen jumped, then grinned, "Eliminating invasive species. HOA rules, join us and we'd handle this properly." I stepped closer, rage simmering. "Those aren't invasive. They're heritage Victorian roses planted in 1960, documented and registered." Her minions fidgeted, but she sniffed. "Someone complained about the smell. Those thorns are a hazard for kids walking by on my private property behind my fence." Bob emerged from the shadows, ex-Sergeant Swagger on. "Let's not throw accusations. We're maintaining standards. Nobody wants a jungle next door." Across the street, Mrs. Watson peeked out, her rock garden long since swapped for Karen's shrubs after similar midnight visits, a pattern forming in the dark. By morning, my roses were dead, black and withered, but Karen's mistake was blooming. I spent lunch at the county records office, uncovering a trail. Every home refusing her HOA faced accidents or violations until they sold, often to her sister-in-law's shell company. That afternoon, I hid high-def cameras among my surviving plants, and by evening, Karen paraded buyers past. "This eyesore will be dealt with soon. We have ways." I documented it all, her group growing brasher, hosting meetings out front, pointing at my flaws for newcomers. "It won't be a problem much longer," she'd say, waving her handbag. My cameras caught them loosening my fence posts, Karen whispering, "Once these fail inspection, she'll pay thousands or join." I knew then this wasn't just harassment. It was a prelude to something darker, and I'd wait, quiet as a judge before sentencing, until her next move showed me how far she'd burn. The harassment sharpened into a relentless siege. My mailbox toppled thrice in a week, anonymous noise complaints filed for days I wasn't home, code officers swarming daily, finding nothing but returning like clockwork, my trash bins vanishing only to resurface with HOA violation tags. Karen's crew amped up their game, hosting meetings out front, her voice a megaphone. "This property," dragging down values. "But don't worry, it's temporary," her designer bag swinging as she pitched to wide-eyed buyers. My cameras caught the escalation, her minions tampering with my historic fence, loosening posts while pretending to measure the sidewalk, Karen hissing. "Once these fail, she'll replace it with our model, thousands, unless she joins." Night after night, I reviewed footage, spotting a chilling pattern. Her inspection team, Bob, Mike Peters, others, snapping photos of my electrical boxes, gas lines, utilities, cataloging vulnerabilities with a predator's patience, their intent creeping into focus, sending ice down my spine. I dug deeper, sleepless, pulling county records that painted a grim picture. 15 homes torched in 5 years, all non-HOA holdouts, sold cheap to Karen's sister-in-law's shell company after accidents, a playbook too neat for chance. My private investigator tracked down ex-neighbors, their tailies mirroring mine. Harassment, vandalism, then fire. Most buckling under pressure, selling for scraps. One old man sobbing over lost photos from a garage blaze the day after he'd refused Karen's invite. Then her ex-treasurer called, voice quaking over coffee 2 towns away, slipping me a USB drive. 5 years of HOA books, cooked under Karen's threats to expose her undocumented status, showing cash dumps after each fire. Millions from insurance payouts rubber-stamped by Bob, her ex-cop husband, who'd ruled every blaze accidental. My cameras had more. Weekly huddles at Karen's with developers drooling over condo plans. One bragging about bribing officials to rezone once they'd cleared enough lots. My Victorian, the linchpin. The final puzzle piece clicked in the city archives. An old map of a highway expansion, my property key to a shopping complex Karen's cronies had quietly encircled with shell company buys, her desperation now crystal clear. She upped the ante, filing daily gripes about my charred eyesore, even proposing an HOA assessment to clean my lot, cash straight to her pocket, while I built my case, silent as a gavel's shadow. The breaking point blazed alive one morning, my clerk Emily bursting into my courtroom mid-sentencing, pale as death. "Your Honor, your house, it's on fire." I shed my robes, racing home, smoke blackening the sky 3 blocks out, the purple trim grandma painted devoured by flames as firefighters battled the inferno, the heat a wall, the beams groaning their last. Through tears, I saw Karen in her driveway, yoga pants pristine, sipping coffee, whispering to her board, their satisfaction a sick tableau. Fire Chief Martinez approached, grim, looks electrical, old house's risky wiring. But I knew better. Yesterday's inspection had cleared everything, a fact I'd ensured after Karen's safety jabs. My phone showed the cameras cut out at 3:00 a.m., 4 hours before the blaze, no coincidence. Bob and Mike lingered in the crowd, their boots, same as the Rose Killers, dusted with ash, while Karen strutted over. Terrible, if only you joined. We enforce safety. Her coffee sip a taunt. I bit my tongue, blood sharp, not revealing my hand, not yet. As my home shell smoked, I made 3 calls. FBI, state attorney, my pie. Karen's flicker of unease as I dialed was my first spark of victory. She'd lit the match, but I'd bring the reckoning. The ashes of my Victorian still smoldered as I stood there, clutching a charred shard of purple trim. Karen's smug, coffee-sipping silhouette burned into my mind. She thought she'd won, thought I'd break, but she just handed me the fuse to her downfall. While she strutted the neighborhood, spinning tailies of my insurance scam, I worked in the shadows, my grief hardening into purpose. My law school buddy, now a real estate sleuth, uncovered a thread. Every torched home in the county over 5 years sold to Karen's sister-in-law's shell company, a pattern screaming intent. My pie tracked down survivors. Mrs. Rodriguez lost her photos, the Patels their grandfather's ashes, each story a mirror of mine. Harassment, threats, then fire, forcing sales at rock-bottom prices to Karen's crew, their tears fueling my resolve as I sifted records, connecting dots under flickering motel lamps. Karen's ex-treasurer became my linchpin. Her USB drive a goldmine of doctored HOA books, cash flooding in post-fires, tied to Bob's accidental rulings as fire investigator, millions pocketed while insurance companies shrugged. My cameras had caught more than arson. Developers at Karen's, salivating over condo blueprints, one boasting of bribed zoning shifts once my lot fell, my home the key to their jackpot. County archives revealed her playbook. 3 other historic neighborhoods gutted the same way. Form an HOA, harass holdouts, torch the stubborn, sell to developers for millions, Karen pocketing community service awards along the way. I wired the treasurer for a sting, her mic catching Karen's brags. Next targets are lined up. Electrical issues are so easy, and threats to vanish her if she talked, every word a nail in her coffin as the FBI logged it. Each day I watched Karen parade past my ruins, waving smugly, oblivious to my net tightening, her complaints about my unsightly lot piled up, her assessment scam a final grab, but every move bolstered my case. Though I clicked late one night, an old highway map showed my land as the linchpin for a shopping complex, her cronies, shell companies encircling it, my refusal the only snag in their multi-million-dollar dream. 6 months of sleepless nights built an arsenal, photos, recordings, financials, witness tears, and when the community center's doors loomed, my heart pounded, judicial robes in my briefcase, FBI wire under my blazer, every step measured. Inside, Karen strutted, coffee mug in hand, PowerPoint glowing with fake violations, her voice booming. 247 Maple Street's a nuisance. Redevelopment starts now. Her smirk daring objections as neighbors shifted, scared, silent. I object, I said, voice slicing the room, heels clicking down the aisle as every head swiveled. Karen's grin flickered. Come to admit defeat. Your ex an eyesore, we're helping. I spread my folder across the table. Security footage shows you on my property the night it burned, curious timing. Her twitch deepened as I piled on bank records of shell company payouts, emails plotting non-joiner purges, texts scheming an accidental fire. The room gasped, her coffee sloshing as she snapped. Ridiculous, I'll sue for defamation. I unfurled my robes, slipping them on. Federal Judge Sarah Martinez presiding over U.S. versus Thompson et al. RICO investigation, corruption, fraud, conspiracy. Her mug shattered on the floor, FBI agents bursting in, cuffing her as Bob bolted and fell, tackled mid-flight. Criminals forget to check their targets, I said, lifting her gavel. Meeting adjourned, her empire crashing as neighbors cheered, fear shattering after years under her thumb. The courtroom buzzed as I straightened my robes in the mirror that morning, the weight of 6 months, work settling on my shoulders. Karen's laughter as my house burned had fueled me, and now she'd face the silence of justice. Packed with neighbors, reporters, and victims from her other scorched conquests, the room crackled with anticipation as she strode in, trading yoga pants for a crisp suit, her bravado faltering when she saw me at the bench, whispering to her lawyer, "That's her, the one whose house we burned," his pen clattering to the floor. The evidence unrolled like a tidal wave. 15 homes torched after defying her HOA. A ruthless cycle of harassment, vandalism, and fire. Properties snatched by her brother-in-law's shell company for pennies. Millions raked in while she grinned at progress. We played my footage, Karen and her crew dousing my roses with gasoline at 2:00 a.m., her voice chilling. Once it burns, she'll sell. The courtroom gasped, her head shaking, mouthing no as her lies unraveled. The surprise gut punch came when Bob turned. Loyalty snapped by the footage's glare. He spilled it all. How they picked targets, planned fires, bribed officials to bury reports, his gravelly voice nomming names as Karen screamed, "Liar!" loud enough for the bailiff to haul her out mid-rant. One by one, victims rose, Mrs. Rodriguez, voice breaking over lost photos. The Patels, mourning ashes destroyed. Each tale shrinking Karen in her seat, her suit no shield against their raw truth. My verdict rang clear, 25 years for her, 15 for each board member. Their faces crumpling, no money or connections left to dodge the bars closing in. Her plea about property values cut off sharp, just as she'd silenced my Rose defenses years back. 6 months later, I stood watching workers paint my rebuilt Victorian's purple trim, Grandma's exact shade. Cuttings from one surviving rose bush blooming again. Karen's house sold off to fund victim payouts, now home to a lively immigrant family whose kids laughed where she'd once snapped violation shots. The new neighbors birthed a real community. No HOA, just a group that shared, not ruled. Block parties filled my garden with empanadas and stories. Mrs. Rodriguez beaming over restored photos her daughter salvaged. The Patels hosting meetings in their vibrant yard. People stopped by as I tended roses, thanking me not for my gavel, but for facing the bully they'd feared, their gratitude a quiet hum beneath the wind chimes song. Karen's coffee mug sat on my courthouse desk, a cracked relic from her collapse, a reminder of Grandma's words. Justice moves slow but sure, and every sunrise I sipped coffee amid my roses, the purple trim framing a view she'd never steal again. Rebuilding wasn't revenge, it was proof. Something more beautiful could rise from her ashes, a home and a neighborhood stronger for the fight. That morning at the HOA meeting replayed as I gardened, her smug sip as my home burned, mirrored by her mug's crash when I donned my robes, the FBI storming in, her empire toppling in handcuffs. She'd pushed me to the edge, thinking I'd fold, but she'd misjudged the quiet woman with the historic deed. 3 decades judging corruption had taught me patience, and now her reign was a cautionary tale whispered at potlucks. The roses nodded in the breeze, purple trim gleaming, and I smiled. Karen had lit the match, but I'd turned the flames into a beacon, one she'd never outrun. The scent of fresh paint lingered as I walked the rebuilt Victorian's porch, the purple trim catching the morning light just as Grandma intended, a defiant splash against the memory of Karen's beige crusade. Every brushstroke a reclaiming of what she'd torched. My roses, nursed back from that lone survivor, bloomed wild and free, their thorns a quiet testament to resilience, while across the street, the new family in Karen's old house strung lights for a barbecue, their laughter a melody where her smug directives once rang. The community association we'd forged, no HOA shackles, just neighbors helping neighbors, thrived in the wake of her ruin, block parties spilling into my garden with shared dishes and stories, a tapestry woven from the ashes she'd left. Mrs. Rodriguez's empanadas warmed my hands at the last one, her restored photos passed around, while the Patels' backyard meetings buzzed with plans for a playground, Karen's shadow fading with every step we took together. Her downfall played on loop in my mind as I tended the roses, 6 months of evidence stacking like bricks, the HOA meeting where I shed my silence for robes, her coffee mug shattering as the FBI swarmed, Bob tackled mid-flight, her empire crumbling in cuffs. The trial had sealed it, 15 fires, her voice on tape plotting my blaze, Bob's confession cracking her facade, 25 years handed down as victims wept and she shrank, no yoga pants or awards to hide behind. Her house sale funded their restitution, but the real payout was this. Maple Street alive again, not a battlefield, but a home, kids biking past doors painted every hue, the wind chimes singing me to sleep without her threats echoing outside. I kept her mug on my desk, a cracked trophy of that night, a nod to Grandma's slow justice creed. Karen had pushed, thinking I'd break, but she'd lit the fuse on her own reckoning. People stopped by daily now, not with violation notices, but gratitude. Old Mr. Johnson, once too scared to fight, hugged me after a potluck. "We should have helped sooner," his tears mingling with mine as I said, "Justice took the long road, it's here now." The local news ran a follow-up. "From terror to triumph." interviewing the Patels about our transformation, their yard a riot of color where Karen's rules once choked life. My quiet stand had rippled, and they thanked me not as a judge, but a neighbor who'd faced the bully down. I'd uncovered her game in those sleepless months. County records of torched holdouts, her sister-in-law's shell company, Bob's rigged reports, developers circling my lot for their highway gold mine. Each piece a weapon I'd wielded with precision, her smug waves tightening the noose she never saw. Sunset gilded the roses as I sat on the swing, sipping coffee, the mug's warmth a counterpoint to Karen's cold sip as my home burned. She'd misjudged the woman with the deed, the judge who'd sentenced corruption for decades, my patience a blade honed by her fire. The rebuilt Victorian stood taller, not just a house but a promise kept, its purple heart beating through a neighborhood she couldn't break. Mrs. Thompson waved from her porch, her shrubs swapped for wildflowers. "Your grandma'd be proud," she called, and I nodded. Karen had raised my past, but I'd grown something stronger, a community rooted in the ashes, blooming where her greed once scorched. The chimes tinkled, and I smiled. Sometimes the best fight isn't revenge, but rising above the flames. The Victorian's porch swing creaked under me as I watched dawn paint the purple trim anew, a ritual now unbroken by Karen's shrill invasions. My coffee steamed in the crisp air, roses nodding in the breeze, their revival a quiet defiance against the night she'd burned them away. Across the street, the new family's kids kicked a ball where her McMansion once loomed, their giggles a balm over the scars she'd carved into Maple Street. Her house, sold to mend her victims' wounds, now pulsed with life, not rules. The community association flourished. No dues or threats, just neighbors pooling tools and time. Last week, we'd built a bench from my old fence posts, the ones she'd sabotaged, now a perch for Mrs. Rodriguez to watch her grandkids play, her restored photos framed in her window. The Patel's yard hosted our latest meeting, plans for a community oven sketched out over chai, Karen's beige nightmare replaced by a mosaic of voices and colors. Her collapse replayed as I sipped, 6 months of threading evidence, the HOA meeting where my robes dropped her mug and her mask, FBI cuffs clicking as she flailed, Bob's betrayal sealing her fate in court. 25 years for her, 15 for her cronies, their millions, built on 15 fires, stripped away my footage of her gasoline-soaked glee, the gavel that fell hardest. She'd screamed liar at Bob, but the victim's stories, Rodriguez's lost albums, the Patel's ashes drowned her out. Now my Victorian rose again, purple trim exact, roses from that lone survivor, a living echo of Grandma's hands. Karen's sale funded it, but the real rebuild was us, block parties spilling laughter where her inspections once prowled, the wind chimes singing free. Her coffee mug stayed on my desk, a relic of her smug sip as flames ate my home, a reminder of Grandma's wisdom. Justice creeps, but it lands sure, and I'd landed it not just for me, but for every soul she'd scorched. Neighbors passed daily, their thanks a hum beneath the roses' scent. Mr. Johnson, once cowed, now tended a wild garden, whispering, "You gave us back our street," while the news piece aired, "Terror to triumph," the Patels beaming amid marigolds, crediting me for standing when they couldn't. I'd pieced her scheme, county records of torched holdouts, her sister-in-law's shell game, Bob's rigged reports, developers eyeing my lot for their highway cash cow, each shard a weapon I'd turned back, her smug waves tightening my trap. The archives showed her history, 3 neighborhoods gutted before, HOAs as battering rams, awards masking millions. She'd targeted me for that highway map, my home the key, her desperation her undoing as I'd wired her treasurer, caught her bragging and sprung the net. Sunrise gilded the trim as I rocked, coffee warming my hands. Karen's sip as my house burned had lit this fire. But I'd turned it into a beacon, my rebuilt home a promise kept, not just to Grandma, but to every neighbor she'd bullied. Mrs. Thompson shuffled over, her wildflowers swaying. "Your grandma danced seeing this," and I smiled. She'd raised my past, but I'd grown a future, roots deeper than her greed could reach. The chimes tinkled, a song of victory, not revenge but rising, a community stitched from ashes, stronger for the fight. I'd judged corruption for decades, but this was personal, and as the roses bloomed, I knew Karen had lost more than her game. She'd lost to the quiet woman she'd never truly seen. The Victorian's purple trim glowed in the evening light as I sat on the porch swing, coffee cooling in my hands, the roses' scent weaving through the air. Grandma's legacy reborn, stronger than the flames Karen had set to erase it. Kids raced bikes past, their shouts mingling with the wind chimes song, the street alive where her beige rain once suffocated it. Her old house, now a hub of immigrant joy, spilled music from an open window, a barbecue's smoke curling up where she'd snapped violation shots. Our community association thrived, no HOA chains, just shared purpose. Yesterday, we'd planted a rose cutting at the Patels. Their yard a riot of color, Mrs. Rodriguez's empanadas warming the circle as we laughed over plans for a mural. Corinne's ashes fertilizing something she'd never grasped. The rebuilt home stood tall, not just mine, but ours, a beacon stitched from her ruin, purple heart beating through every wild bloom and painted door. Her end replayed as I rocked, 6 months of silent evidence, the HOA meeting where my robes shattered her mug and her world, FBI swarming as Bob's confession cracked her lies, 25 years locked in with her cronies, 15, their fire-lit millions gone. My footage, her gasoline smirk at 2:00 a.m., and 15 victims, tears had buried her, her property values, please silenced as I once muted her rose rants. The sale funded my rebuild, but the real victory was this: Maple Street breathing free, block parties where her inspections prowled, chimes singing over her threats. Her mug sat cracked on my desk, a trophy of that smug sip as my home burned, echoing Grandma's creed. Justice dawdles, but it strikes true. And I'd struck not for vengeance, but for every soul she'd scorched, my gavel falling slow and sure after decades judging her kind. Neighbors waved now, their thanks a thread in the roses. Mr. Johnson's wild garden bloomed. "You saved us," he'd said, while the news dubbed it terror to triumph. The Patels hosting amid marigolds, praising the stand I took when fear held them. I'd unraveled her web, county records of torched holdouts, her sister-in-law's shell, Bob's rigged reports, developers drooling over my lot's highway key. Each piece a blade I'd turned, her waves tightening my trap, archives showing 3 neighborhoods gutted before, her awards a mask for millions. The wired treasurer caught her brag. "Electrical's easy," sealing her fate as I'd sprung it, her targeting me for that map, her fatal misstep. She'd burned my past, but I'd grown a future, roots sinking where her greed flamed out. Twilight settled, roses swaying as I sipped. Corinne's sip as my home blazed had sparked this. But I'd forged a light, my Victorian a promise kept to Grandma and every bullet soul, its purple soul a defiance she'd never snuff. Mrs. Thompson ambled over, wildflowers in hand. "Your grandma'd cheer," and I nodded. She'd raised my history, but I'd built a community deeper than her fire could reach, the chimes of victory hymn. 3 decades judging corruption honed me, but this was mine. Corinne lost not just her game, but to the quiet judge she'd misread, my revenge not in her fall, but in rising, a neighborhood blooming from her ashes, more beautiful than she'd ever dreamed. The stars winked and I smiled. Sometimes justice isn't catching the wicked, it's showing them what grows when they're gone.